Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple more minutes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Docusign Developer Webinar, Deep Dive into Tabs. My name is Melissa Marsh from our Developer Programs Marketing team. I'll be moderating and running our backroom logistics today. Next slide, Paige. Thank you. I'm here with Paige Rossi, our Senior Programmer Writer, who will be presenting and demoing, and Carissa Jacobson, Programmer Writer, and Andy Singh, Developer Support Engineer 2, who will address questions via the Q&A box throughout the session and after the demo when we open up the floor to questions. And next slide. Thank you. Now, before we get started, I have a few quick housekeeping items to go over. You are placed in listen-only mode, and the session is being recorded. You'll receive an email in about a week with a link to the webinar recording, along with other resources we covered today. Please be sure to use the Q&A button to ask questions at any time, and feel free to ask them as they occur to you. And we'll answer those via the Q&A box, or let you know we'll answer them live after the demo. To copy and save your questions, simply right-click on them and copy and save to your desktop or document. Next slide. Now, is this webinar right for you? This is a webinar for developers. If you're not a developer, you're totally welcome to stay, or you can check out our Docusign 101 course for something a little less technical at events.docusign.com/Docusign101. Into the chat for you, for those of you who would like that. And then this is just our safe harbor notice. All of the values, the email addresses, the keys, the secrets, tokens, and other personal information you might see here today are for demo purposes only, and those will be deleted or revoked after the webinar. Now you should see a quick poll on your screen in just a moment. If you can answer those questions, that will help us understand where you are in your development journey and enable us to customize content for this and future webinars. Okay, that's it for housekeeping. Let's go ahead and get started. Paige, take it away.
Thanks, Melissa. So just to give a quick overview of today's agenda, we're going to be talking all about tabs. And if you're not sure what tabs are, I'll explain what they are and how to use them with the Docusign eSignature REST API. And I'll also show you what tabs look like in the JSON request bodies when you're making raw API calls. And we'll talk about how to place tabs in your documents, the different options that you have for how to do that. And then we'll be doing a code demo and have some time for questions at the end. So to start off, what are tabs? So tabs are sometimes called tags or fields. You might have heard that terminology. Sometimes we use those interchangeably, but for the purposes of talking about the API, I like to use the word tabs, and that's what they're called in the API as well. And tabs are places in a document where a recipient provides input or where a calculated value is displayed. And so this image shows some different types of tabs, and we'll be looking at these in our demo later, but the one that you're probably most familiar with is the Sign Here tab. So that's this box here. If you've ever signed a document with Docusign, you've probably used that tab. But there are a lot of other types as well, and some of them are places where the user will input information, like text here, or by checking a checkbox maybe. But other times it is a calculated value, and so you can see that here the first and last name tabs, those are not for the user to input, and we'll see these in our demo as well. And so before we get into the API, let's just take a moment to look at tabs in the Docusign web UI and just make sure we're all familiar with what they are. So I'm going to go to the UI, and I have a draft document here. And so I'm just going to continue so we can get into the tagging view. And so this document has, or this envelope has two signers. And then if you've ever sent a document through the Docusign web UI, you've probably seen this view before. This is where you can add the different tabs by dragging and dropping. And so you might have done something like adding a Sign Here tab. We have some, I'll clear them so we can start over. But essentially, you would normally just drag and drop exactly where you want it to be in the UI. You might add some checkboxes, add another checkbox. This is kind of what it would look like. And these tabs that we're adding here are all for our first signer. And we'll talk about this in terms of the API as well, but I wanted to call out that tabs are assigned to a recipient. And so we had two different recipients on this envelope. If I switch to the second signer here, you can see there's a different color for the tabs. And so when I drag that tab there, that will be just for that second recipient. And a good way to illustrate this is through the recipient preview. So I'm gonna go to that here. And when it loads, we'll see that we're viewing this as our second signer right now. And so only that tab that was blue is going to appear because this is the only tab that we created for that recipient. But if we switch to the first signer, we'll see some different tabs because those were assigned to that first recipient. And so we're going to get into this when we talk about the API, but I just wanted to call it out because it's kind of an important framing for how to think about tabs and how to think about how they relate to your recipients. So back to the presentation. And so now that we've been in the UI for a little bit, let's start talking about the API. And so most likely, a lot of you are developers and you're probably thinking that you want to do all of this programmatically. Well, luckily the eSignature REST API allows you to do that. And so with the API, you can create documents and templates that have over 20 different types of tabs. And we have SDK support in 6 different languages that are listed here. And for today's demo, I'm going to be using a bash script. And so the code will really mostly be the JSON request body, where we're building the envelope definition with the tabs. And I'll be making the raw API calls through that bash script. So if you're used to using an SDK language, one of these languages here, it might look slightly different because you'll be using the objects and models that come with that SDK, but the general structure is kind of the same. And so bash is what we're looking at today to kind of make it more applicable across all of them. And so now we can talk about what I like to call the anatomy of a tab. And that's kind of just referring to the different fields in the JSON request body that make up a tab. And so this is an example of what a tab looks like in JSON, actually what 2 tabs look like in the JSON. And so you can see we have sign here tabs. These are all sorted into a list here, and text tabs. And so it's important to know that when you have different types of tabs, the JSON structure sorts them into lists of a certain type. And so sign here tabs are one type of tab. All the sign here tabs will be in this list. Same with the text tabs. And there are a lot of other properties that can appear here. And we'll get into some of those as we get into the demo, but these are just some of them for now. And so just further highlighting that they are sorted into lists of different tab types. So the sign here tabs, just that's what the key is for the list of sign here tabs. And then there could be one or multiple sign here tabs in this list. And same thing goes for the text tabs. And then, like I mentioned, you could have multiple tabs of the same type. And so you'll just add another piece of JSON here into the list. And this creates a second sign here tab. And I've talked a little bit about how tabs are assigned to recipients. And so this is what that looks like in the JSON. So you have your list of signers with the signer email, signer name, and then the tabs are within that signer. And so that's where our list of tabs goes, or many lists of tabs of different types. And then talking a little bit about placing tabs in your document. So how do we get the tabs to appear where we want them to on the document or on the page? So you have 2 different options for this. One is through X and Y coordinates, and that's fixed positioning. Or you can also use anchor tagging, and we sometimes call that auto place, using anchor strings. And so these are 2 different tab definitions that show the difference between these, and we'll show the difference in our demo as well. But you can see how this fixed positioning tab has an X position field and a Y position field. And so these actually represent like pixels on the page. If you imagine the page is in a graph with an X-axis and a Y-axis, no matter what the document looks like, the tab is always going to appear at this position, at these coordinates. And we also needed to specify the document ID and the page number here because we want to make sure that the tab is appearing on the right page. With anchor tagging on the right, it's a little bit different. And so anchor tagging uses an anchor string value and looks for that value inside of the documents in an envelope. And then it places the tab next to that string, wherever that string appears in the document. And our demo, we're mostly going to be looking at anchor tagging, although we will show an example of fixed positioning as well. So we'll see this more as we get into it, but you can see that this anchor string here, this /SN1/, anywhere that that string appears in the document is where that sign here tab will appear. And that's kind of convenient because it gives you some flexibility. Maybe you don't know exactly what page of the document you want your tab to appear on, but you know the text where it's going to appear. You can just make sure that that is always going to be in the right place by using anchor tagging. So speaking of the demo, let's get into it. So I'm going to get out of here and go to Visual Studio Code. And so the code that I'm using here, this is kind of modeled off of our quick start, our authentication code grant quick start with an embedded signing example. So if you're curious about anything aside from the tabs, like you want to know more about authentication, that's kind of out of the scope of today's demo, but you can find this code in our GitHub repositories and on the Developer Center by going to the Quick Start. But I've kind of edited it here for the purposes of our demo. And so the first thing I'm going to do is just run this, and we'll see the embedded signing session without any tabs in it. This is just the authentication. And it's automatically starting an embedded signing session. And so this is just an empty document with no tabs in it. And so because there were no tabs, that's why we were brought to this view where we, the recipient, can drag and drop tags onto the document. And that works out pretty well, but in a lot of cases, you're going to want to kind of structure where your recipients can enter information. And so we'll do that through adding tabs through the API. And so this, I just wanted to give an illustration of what our document looks like without any tabs in it. And I should also mention that I talked about how we're going to be using anchor strings to place the tabs in the documents, but I want to call out that we're not actually using anchor strings that you can see visibly here right now. And that's because there's kind of a trick that we like to do, which is to change the font color of those anchor strings. And so I have a copy of the document here. And this is just going to kind of show that it's a little like, these are strings that you might not want to appear in your document. They're not English, they're not actual words, they're kind of could almost look like code. But we've placed them here because we know that this string is not going to appear anywhere else in the document. And so it could be tricky to use a different string, just like this document is kind of straightforward. We know this is the only text in it, but if you have a more lengthy document, if you have words that could appear many times throughout the document, for example, signed, but you might not want it to be the same sign here tab, it's kind of better to just make sure that your anchor string is exactly where you want it to be. And so I've created all of these anchor strings in these strings that are not going to appear anywhere else in the document. And right now we're seeing them in red font. But if we go back to the embedded signing session, those strings are here in white font, but you just can't see them because they're blending with the background. So that's kind of a good trick if you want to have a little more control over your anchor strings. And that's what I like to do, but we can always refer back to this document where we can see them if we forget what they are, if we just want to double check anything. So yeah, these are the strings we're going to be using as we get into the coding. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And we're going to go to our request body. And so right now you can see there's not much here. It's just an empty list of tabs, but we do have our signer within our recipients list. And so this is an envelope definition, and this is where we're going to be defining the tabs all in here. And they're all going to be associated with this one embedded signer recipient. And so first I'm going to add the Sign Here tab. And we're going to do that similar to what we saw in the slideshow in the presentation. We're going to create a list of Sign Here tabs. And this just looks like this, a list. And within the list, we'll create a JSON snippet for the Sign Here tab. And so before we place this using the anchor string, we can place it using fixed positioning just to give an illustration of what happens when we do that. And so the first thing I'm going to add is the field for the page number, because we know we need that if we're using fixed positioning. And it's on page 1. And I'm also going to add the document ID. Also is 1 because we see that up here. This is the document in the envelope. And then we can set the X position and Y position. And I'm going to set it arbitrarily because ultimately we're going to go back and use the anchor string. So I'll just set it to something like 200 and 200 again. And hopefully that will be all we need to get this tab in our document. So let's run the embedded signing script again. And if everything went as expected, once this loads, Okay, so the sign here tab is here, and this is 200 pixels on the y-axis and 200 pixels on the x-axis. And this is obviously not where we want this to appear, but if we played around with it, or if we knew exactly what x and y coordinates we wanted for it to appear down here, we could do that. But since we know that we have that anchor string, we're just going to use the anchor string to make sure that this tab is appearing exactly where we want it. So we'll go back and change that, but that's how you would do it if you wanted to use fixed positioning. This also kind of illustrates why I prefer anchor strings, just because it's kind of less thinking involved. You don't need to figure out, oh, what are the coordinates within the document of where I want this tab. Sometimes that can be nice, but in our case and for this document, I think it's a lot easier to use anchor strings. So we can sign this and finish the document. And I'll just close that. And let's go back. And so we're going to edit this to use anchor strings instead. So we're not going to need any of these fields. And we're going to add our anchor string. And the anchor string for this was sign here in the slashes. And then we're going to add a few other fields. One of them is anchor units. This is going to be relevant with the next field we add. We're going to set that to pixels. And then we're going to add the anchor X offset and anchor Y offset. And I'm going to set these to values that I think will work, but we can edit this as we go. And so these two fields, what they do is these will offset our tab from the anchor string a certain amount. And so this also gives you some more control. Say you have the anchor string, but maybe it's not looking quite right. You want to shift it a couple pixels left or right or up or down. You can do that through these fields. And so let's run it, and our sign here tab should be there. And it looks like that's pretty much where we want it. That's much better. We can say we want to move it up a little bit. We can play around a little bit with that anchor Y offset. Maybe we want to set it to something like 5 instead of 10. But you can see that with that anchor string, the tab was placed here. So let's go add some more tabs before we keep running this document. And let's add the first and last name tabs. And so those are examples of tabs that are using calculated values. And so those are going to fill out the first name and last name of the user. And I'll do that by adding a new list of tabs. So after our list of sign here tabs, we're going to add first name tabs. And then we'll also add one for last name tabs. And with the first name tabs, we're also going to be using an anchor string. So let's do sort of similar to what we did above. Actually, we can copy a bunch of this. And we're just going to change the anchor string. And so for the first name tabs, it was FN1. And we are not going to need really, I think, as much of a Y offset here, so we can just remove that. And we can give this a tab label as well. And that can just kind of be a good way of keeping your tabs straight, especially if you're going to be getting tabs back through the API. It can be good to set this value just so you can keep track of which tab is which. So we'll call it first name. And that should be good for the first name. And then we can do something very similar for the last name. So we'll just copy this. But the anchor string was different here, so we're going to change it. And we'll change the tab label as well. And then let's add the date sign tab while we're here too. That's another calculated value. And so we'll add another list of tabs. And you'll see as we go through this demo, we're going to end up having a lot of different types of tabs, and they'll each get their own list here. Some of them will have more than one tab within it, but you can see that our request body is really starting to grow as we add more tabs here. So let's add date sign tabs. And we'll give that, it'll be really the same as this. We can paste again and just change the anchor string. and we'll call this date signed. So let's run this, and we should have a couple more tabs in our document. Okay, it looks like that did work because we see that our date signed tab is here, and we have our first and last name here as well. And as I mentioned, the first name and last name tabs, those are not text tabs. So if you wanted your recipient to enter their first and last name and not use information that you have stored about them, then you would want to have a text tab here instead. But if you have that information, you want to take it from their Docusign account, then you could use these tabs and they'll fill in that information for you. And if you look at the list of tab types that we have, which I can actually show in a moment on the API reference, you'll see that there's a lot of different types of tabs. You could do a lot with just text tabs if you wanted to, but you can also see if there's a different type of tab that might be a little bit more tailored to what you want. And so that's what we're doing here. So let's go back and add the email address tab. And right now to finish the document, it's pretty simple. We just click to sign. So we'll do that. And go back, and we're going to add the email tab. And we're going to actually do it as a text tab here, just because we haven't used any text tabs yet. So let's add a new list of tabs, text tabs. And we're going to be doing the same thing with anchor string, anchor units. We can copy those. Except for we'll change the anchor string again to match the one that we have for the email address. And then we'll also add an anchor offset, an X offset. And then since this is a text tab, we're going to add a width as well. And this will just affect the size of the box where they can enter their text. And so we'll do something like 100, and this should be in pixels as well. And we'll give it a tab label. And this should be enough to add our text tab. So we'll run it again to check. And now we have this text tab here. And so that's great. We can enter our email address in there, and we can see this is required. And so we can't finish the document until we've actually filled that out. But let's go back, and I think I kind of want to play around with the X and Y offsets a little bit, because I think this should be a little bit higher. This is not totally aligned with the email address. So let's go and look at that and see what we can do to fix that. And so for the text tab, we have an X offset, but we didn't set a Y offset. Maybe adding that will help, because currently the X offset is helping us make sure that it's offset a little bit from the text that we have in the document. But I think we want to do something like -5 here, and that will move that up and be more aligned. And we can do the same thing here with the sign here tab. We probably just don't want it to be, well, we'll change it to 5 and see what happens, and we can keep playing around with it. I'll run this again. And this looks a lot better, actually. This is adding that -5 one, that Y offset, that kind of aligned this here. So that's good. And this one also moved up higher. And so sometimes you just have to play around with those and try it once and then run the document again and just make sure that it looks right, because with the anchor string, it will be generally in the right place, but you kind of want to make sure that it is perfectly aligned. And so we could even do that with the date sign tab as well, because it's a little bit lower here. But sometimes you just have to use trial and error with those. So let's go back. We can do the same thing with the date sign tab. We'll do -5 because that seemed to work for another one. And then let's keep adding some tabs here. So I think now we can add the checkbox tab that we're going to use to check our availability for days of the week in the form. And so we're going to add a new list of checkbox tabs. and we'll add a couple to start. So we're going to give these labels because there's going to be 7 of them, 1 for each day of the week. And it's good to kind of know the difference. So we'll call this Sunday availability. And then we'll add an anchor string. This was XSU. And then we'll add some anchor units. And a Y offset. I think this will place it where we want it to be, but if it's not perfect, we can always go back and change it like we were doing with the other ones. And that's kind of all we need to start. So let's copy this a couple times for a couple more days of the week. And we'll just change it to Monday, change the anchor string as we go. And it is nice with checkboxes, a lot of this is going to be very reusable. And so it's a lot of different tabs, but it's not too much different code. It should be pretty easy for us to copy paste it. We'll do one more before we run it just to make sure everything looks good. And actually, before we do that, I'm going to kind of force an error to show us what can happen here. And so we have checkbox tabs written out here, but let's say we misspelled it. And so I'm going to run it. And what should happen is that we'll go to our document, but there won't be any new tabs. So it'll look the same as it did before. And that looks like that's what happened. There's no checkbox tabs here. And so this is also something to keep in mind. Sometimes things can go wrong and you might misspell something, and the API is just going to ignore those misspelled things. If it's not a field that the API recognizes, it will just ignore it and continue with the other tabs. And so if you ever run into this issue where you're not seeing tabs in your document, it could be just as simple as a spelling error. We can fix that pretty easily. So we'll go back. We'll just spell it correctly, run it again. And we should see some of those checkbox tabs. Perfect. So we have a bunch of them here. Let's go add the last few because this is looking good. I think the alignment is pretty good. And it should be as simple as just copying and pasting those last few. So I'll do that. And just make sure that we're changing our anchor strings. So that should be all 7 of the checkboxes. I think we can run it and just make sure. So it's pretty easy to add a bunch of different checkboxes like this, but let's say maybe we want to have some control over how the user is going to interact with those checkboxes. And so right now, when you hover over it, it says optional. We can check, well, it looks like it's checking all of them for some reason, which is something we might have to debug, but let's see if that changes when we go for the validation that I was going to do. So we'll go back to the code. What we're going to try to do here is add some validation so that the user needs to check at least 2 of these checkboxes. We'll close the document. And I'm not sure if, oh, you know what? This is actually a misspelling on my part. So I said tab labels, and I think without giving a tab label, it's just ignoring that because it doesn't, we don't have tab labels, we only have tab label. I think that's why it is treating them all as one. Let's just run this one more time to validate that. Okay, that was it. So this is more what I was expecting. So we just needed to make sure that we had that tab label field, and I unfortunately added tab labels, which is not a field that the API recognizes, but now that we fixed it, we have these checkboxes. We can check as many or as few as we want, but we do want to add some validation. And so going back to the code, we're going to create a tab group. And that will group all of these checkbox tabs together. And with that, we can create a rule for the group of checkboxes. And so we're going to add something called a tab group. It's going to kind of look like another tab. It'll be another tab type, if you will. Like we'll add a list here and call it tab groups. But it's not actually a tab in itself. It's going to group together all of our checkbox tabs. And so the first thing we need is the group label. We'll just call it days available. And we also need to set some other fields like the recipient ID. Even though we know that this is within that recipient, it's just something you have to do with the tab group. And we're going to set a validation message. This will appear when we hover over each of those checkbox tabs or the group as a whole. We're going to say, please select at least 2 days. And we're also going to add a group rule. And I'm going to set that to select at least. And we'll come back to the different options for these rules later on. And a minimum required value. We're setting that to 2. And then we have to also set the document ID and page number here. Even though we're using anchor strings with the checkbox tabs, it's still required for a tab group to use these values. So it's not really going to do much, but we just have to have the fields here. Page 1. And same with the X position and Y position. Even though we're not using this, we'll just set them to 0, but we do have to have the fields filled out for a tab group. And then 2 more fields here. We'll add tab scope, which is document. And that's just saying that all of the tabs in this group, it's within the document. And then tab type. And this is the tab group. And so a lot of the fields here don't seem as relevant. You're just gonna kind of have to use them if you want to have a tab group. But the important ones are the group rule and the minimum required. And once we run this, I'll go to the API reference and show you some of the different options for this. But this is saying that we want the user to select at least 2. And if we change minimum required to maybe 3 or 4, it would change accordingly. And so it'd be required to select 3 checkboxes or 4 checkboxes. But in this case, we're sticking with 2. So we created this group, but we don't know yet which tabs are actually part of this group. And so we need to go back to our checkbox tabs, and we need to add a tab group label to all of them. So I'll add it here and then I'll copy paste. This is just a tab group labels field. This one actually is plural labels because it could be a list. So your tabs could be members of multiple tab groups. And we're going to add the value days available because that's the group label for this tab group. And that's all it takes. And so we're going to copy this into all 7 of our checkbox tabs. And I think that's it. And so we can save that and run the embedded signing again. And so now we can already see a slight difference. So these are red now. And when we hover over them, it does say required. And it says select at least 2 fields. And then our validation message, which we set to please select at least 2 days. And so the validation message could be something different because we see that it's already telling us how many fields we need to select. This part you can control that validation message, but the select at least 2 fields is going to come from those values that we set. And so if we've selected 1, that won't be enough to finish the document. We have to do at least 2, and we can do more than 2 as well. And so I just want to go to the API reference for a minute to kind of show you where you can find this. And so this is in the Developer Center, the eSignature REST API. If you go to the API reference here, everything about tabs that we're talking about today, you can find under envelopes and envelope recipient tabs. And so this is a really great place to, if you want to find out more about the different tab types, there's a complete list here. But also when you go into the create endpoint, then you can see all the different fields that you might need. And so let's find the ones we're talking about now. So we'll expand this and we're gonna, it's in checkbox tabs. So we'll expand the checkbox tabs. And I'm just gonna search because it might be a lot to scroll through. Okay, so required, it's telling us does not apply. Oh, because group rule is in the tab group, that's why. So we're in the wrong place. But basically, if you expand any of the tab types here, you'll see all the different fields that you can add to customize your tabs. And there are a lot. We're not going through all of them today, but you can play around with it. You can check out the API reference, and there's a lot that you can do there. So we're looking at tab groups. Look for group rule again. Okay, so here's that group rule field. And we used select at least, but we could have used something different, like select exactly. Maybe we don't want them to select more than 2, just exactly 2. We would have set it to that value. And like this says, this is letting us know how the minimum required or maximum allowed rules are interpreted. And so if you remember, we used minimum required in our code. We can go back and look. We go to our tab group. So we set minimum required to 2, and that group rule is interpreting how this is being enforced. And so let's say we set minimum required to 2 also, but we wanted this to be select at most, then they would be able to select less than 2. So you kind of have to play around with that and see what works for your use case, but you can set different validation around how you want people to check your checkboxes. So I think we just have a few more tabs to add. Let's run it, or let's go back to our document to look at what's left. Okay, so we just want to add 2 more tabs here for the opting in to SMS alerts and the phone number. And so we're going to do this by creating a conditional tab. And conditional tabs are tabs that will appear in the document when other conditions are met. And so we're going to create a conditional tab for the phone number, and it's going to appear if the opt-in to SMS alerts checkbox is checked. So first we need to add another checkbox tab. And so I'm going to go back to our code, and we're going to go to our list of checkboxes, and we'll add another tab. And so this one, tab label, SMS opt-in, and then we can copy anchor string, anchor Y offset, all that's going to be the same, except for we know the anchor string will be something else. It's actually SMS check. And then we need to set a value here. And so we're going to come back to this once we've created the other tab. The other tab that we wanted to add is a text tab. So we'll go back to our list of text tabs. Here it is. We're going to add another tab here. And this is going to be that text tab that can appear to take the phone number. And so similar to this, we'll copy because we can use a lot of this again. The anchor string is going to be different. And we have the width is here. I think we will say required is false. And we also need to add, well, we'll change this to phone number first. We need to add 2 values here for conditional parent label and conditional parent value. And these are going to say that this text tab is a conditional child, and the conditional parent is that checkbox that we just created, but we don't know that unless we set these values to match the values on that. And so the tab label on that checkbox was SMS opt-in, so we'll do that. And then this is going to be set to on. And so that's just saying that the value of this, the tab with this label, when that value is on, as in the checkbox is checked, then this tab will appear. And so let's try to run this and see if it worked. It didn't. Okay, invalid request body. Oh, probably I'm missing something. Line 70, we can go back up. Oh, it's just somewhere within the tabs. Okay, something I just did created an error. So this is kind of good live debugging, but make sure, oh, we're missing a comma here. That's what it is. Okay, I think it will work now. That's kind of the catch with typing live JSON. There's a lot that can go wrong. Okay, so now we see our checkbox tab is here, and it's optional, but let's fill this out because this is our complete document. So I'm gonna add an email here, and I'm gonna opt into SMS alerts. And so when we click that button, the phone number tab the text tab that we're using to collect the phone number appears here. But if we don't want to opt in, we don't have to. So I can opt in, put in a fake phone number. And then we know that we have to select at least 2 of these fields and sign. And that's all we need to do to complete the document. And you'll notice that the finish document button didn't become available for us to click until we had completed the document how we were supposed to. So we can finish it, and that's that. And that was kind of the whole demo that I had planned. We can go back and see if there's any questions we can answer, or I can show a couple other quick tips and tricks. But I don't know, this might just take a minute. It could be my internet or it could be Docusign, but this is not really important to finish because we filled out all the tabs. So go back here.
All
So
right,
are there
that was
any
excellent.
questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Paige. That was excellent. Andy and Carissa, I think we had quite a few questions that might benefit everybody. If we want to cover the ones maybe we marked as answer live first.
Yeah, I could take that one. So it was a series of questions, and Manal here is using the title tab. So that's related to a recipient's title. And he was wondering why it was maybe not populating, and why it looks like a regular text box when he's sending it. My understanding is that the title field, you can't set it in the API call itself, and instead what it's pulling from is the recipient's profile in Docusign. Is it okay if I share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna take that on if I can, and I can maybe visually show this a little more. Okay, do you see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
You might want to go full screen, maybe.
I think that's that's the best I could do here for the screen with the signing session. So we're looking at the title tab here. So this is sort of under the section that's sort of related to the recipient information. So the name and email pulls from the API request. Where company and title would come from is in your manage profile. So if that recipient sort of matches an existing Docusign user, it would pull this information, which at least for this person, there's nothing filled in here. For this other example here, I have that information filled in for company and title. And so for that one that was filled in, when I opened the signing session, you could see that it gets filled in. If there's nothing there, then it would prompt you to fill in a title. The reference doc that I'm aware of that kind of mentions that a little bit more is, give me a sec, let me pull that over. Sorry, let me let me just find that tab. Okay, so this page, which is a more general overview of tabs inside of eSignature, kind of calls this out a little more. So if we scroll down to the company and title section, it mentions that it would fill automatically with what's specified in the My Identity information. And if they don't have a Docusign account or it's not specified, it will show up as a blank text field. So what's seen there is the expected behavior if the recipient doesn't have a profile that Docusign can pull from to pull the company and title info. So hopefully that helps answer that, and kind of adds more info for why you might be seeing a text field where the person's being prompted to add this info rather than it getting pulled automatically.
All right, thanks, Andy. Were there a couple others too?
So there was also one related to if there was a way to auto-populate the date field once the user has clicked completed or like has completed the signing action. I believe what you would want to use is the date signed tab in that scenario, unless I'm misunderstanding the use case. The date signed tab is something that's auto-populated and would record when the recipient has completed their signing action. So that sounds like it's a match for the use case if I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, if it's helpful, we had a date sign tab in that example, so I can just show that again quickly. But there's also date tabs, and that's the kind of tab that won't be automatically populated. So like Andy said, the date sign tab is probably the one that you want to use, but that's what we were using here. And so we didn't have to type in this June 20th, 2023. This was automatically populated because it's pulling today's date. So I think that does seem like that would be what you would want to use.
So I think the other questions from Manal were kind of connected. He was giving a little more info on those. And then I think there was one a little more about the X position, Y position, the offsets that I think Carissa covered. And I agree with her answer there.
Yeah, that question reminded me of something that would maybe be helpful to share, which is talking about the API logs, because that can sometimes be helpful when you're adding tabs to a document. So if there's not anything else right now, I can do that quickly. But so we were, I might have to log back in, but we were looking before at the tagging view within the UI. And I think Carissa mentioned that you can kind of use this as sort of a reference if you need. But sometimes I also find it helpful to use the logs, the API logs. And so let me get out of here. So the API logs are captured like anytime you do anything in the Docusign UI. You can use them also to check your work and like look at what's happening when you're making API calls. But some kind of a fun hack that we like to use sometimes is if you turn on your API logs to start, so you go to My Preferences. And then we can see mine is full right now, but if we clear them and we enable logging here, then anything that we go do in the UI will come back to this page and we'll be able to download the API logs for that. And so if we go back to our document, the draft, and if we add a few more tabs here, I think when we go back to the API logs, we'll see what those tabs look like. And so I think if we just drag and drop this one, for example, I can do a couple others. And I'll just send this, but once we send it, we'll go back to look at the logs. And so now you can see I had just enabled it after clearing the 50 logs, but now there's 23. So I'm going to download those. And if we open the zip file and open that, then these are all the different API calls that happened when we were in the UI. And so we didn't make any API calls through my script or anything like that. This is just what was happening there. And I think if we can find, let's see, this was update envelope recipients. We might be able to find one about tabs, or it might just be within the envelope, but you can open these and start to see, well, let's see, created add envelope tabs. Okay, yeah, so this is that full name tab that we had added. You can start to open these and see like what the JSON representation of the tab that you created in the UI looks like. And there are a bunch of fields here that we clearly didn't set in the UI, but they're here because that's kind of what's happening on the back end. So sometimes if something doesn't look right in your API call, you can try to do this and see what you get back. And we can see like the X position is here, the Y position is here. And so when I was dragging it onto the screen, I wasn't thinking, 193, 192, but I'm able to see that in the API log. So sometimes this can be helpful as well. And just for debugging anything that's going on with the API, but it is sometimes nice to see what the API equivalent of your work in the UI looks like.
Okay. Hey, Andy, did we answer the one that said, is there a way of auto-populating the date field once users completed the signature field?
Yeah, so that was one of the points that I was going through, and I think there's some follow-up here for the two that are open.
Okay.
I believe, if I'm understanding it correctly, there's maybe a concern about the date format or what's being displayed in the field. I'm not sure if there is a way to change the date format. I'm not sure if Paige or Carissa is aware, like maybe in adding extra info like the time. I'm not sure if that's what the question is referring to, but I believe
Yeah.
it just auto-populates in that standard format.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I'm not sure, and we might be able to find out and follow up, but I'm not, it might be one of the settings, like signing settings, but it also, we can look at the date signed reference to see. But I did think there was a way, but I could be wrong. Just see if any of these fields
Okay.
have to do
So
with.
Summer said it's an account-wide setting for date format.
Okay. So you would have to change it in your settings and possibly contact support to help change that.
All right. And if those of you didn't catch that, support would be developers.docusign.com/support if you need. And that's also in the chat. Looks like we have another question, a couple more questions maybe that came in.
For Pedro's question, I don't think this is something that would fall into the tabs category. I don't know if I can pull up something too quickly, but if anything, since it is a different topic, I think that could be a good question for a support case as well.
Okay. And again, that is developers.docusign.com/support. I think we have time for one more question. Are there any, like, from our common questions that people ask about tabs, Andy, that might benefit the whole group?
Let me take a quick peek. Believe there was one that I thought might be helpful. Sorry, someone else could go if anything.
I think a few folks have asked about the webinar and the recording and resources. We will be sending those out about a week from today, so check your email next Tuesday and we'll have that ready for you.
Yeah, and I think for the follow-ups from Summer, yeah, I don't think there is, I guess, a mechanism available for the API where you're able to sort of override the account default setting for date format and have the field formatted that way. I think that's a pretty good point. Generally, oh, and I see one more question from Summer. Well, I guess the Apex toolkit is definitely one of the APIs that's available, and we definitely support that. And you can do all of these tab operations with that as well. I can kind of reply to your question there with a link to the reference page for that. But yeah, we definitely support the Apex toolkit as well. That should be included too.
Yep, and we'll actually have a webinar on that on July 11th. So when we get to the resources here in just a second, which we could probably do now, wrap up the Q&A. I'll let Andy and Carissa kind of handle the one-offs directly. And thank you, Paige, for pulling those up. If we didn't get to your question today, or if there is something that you think of afterwards, you can always reach out to us at developers@docusign.com by email. You could go to Stack Overflow, which is stackoverflow.com, and tag Docusign API for a community response. Or you could place a support ticket, which we've mentioned a couple times, developers.docusign.com/support for further assistance. Some of the more common resources for tabs related from today, we've got the quick start link there, as well as code launchers and the envelope recipient tabs link. These were all posted in the chat, but you'll also receive them again by email in about a week from today. You can also check out Docusign University at support.docusign.com/Docusign University for various trainings. Our developer blog, we have a couple on tabs that would be very interesting, and upcoming webinars. So you can go to developers.docusign.com/developer-events and get the full list of all of our upcoming sessions. For July, we have July 11th, our next API office hours, which again will feature the Apex toolkit, how to get started with that. You can always come back though and ask any question you want about our APIs. It's really like an open office hours for you to get your questions answered to help with your API integration. If you're in EMEA or that time zone works for you, we have one July 25th as well at 11 a.m. BST, live from London. And then you can also check out our YouTube videos at youtube.com/Docusign for developers. I think there's one more slide. Yep. If you're a partner, the whole process to get started with our APIs is a little bit different. So you can go to the partner portal or the sign up page and check out how to become a partner, or email our partners at docusign.com. And then we'll also share these resources with the guide selector and the composite template model as well. So that does it for us today. I want to thank Paige for leading the webinar, Chris and Andy for addressing all the great questions, and also thank all of you for joining us. Be sure to take the post survey, tell us how we did and what you'd like to see for upcoming webinars. And we hope you all have a great remainder of your day. Thank you, everybody.